Hi everyone. This morning I was speaking about Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. I began by reflecting on the fact that, briefly, that in our lives we need laws and boundaries, we need rules um, in order for us to live well and to live in a way that enables all of us as a collective, as a community, to thrive. And Jesus begins this passage by saying, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Now, um, when he says the law and the prophets, that's New Testament shorthand for the whole of the Old Testament. And so Jesus is saying everything in the Old Testament was foreshadowing my coming because all of this is fulfilled in me. These laws were given to you so that you might know how to live. And I haven't come to get rid of them, but to bring them to completion. Now he says, "Truly I tell you," and that means take note. When he says, "Truly I tell you," that means take note. He says, not one small stroke, not the least kind of dot of the whole law. No detail is going to disappear until heaven and earth passes away, until all is accomplished. So God's law remains for eternity, or until God determines that it's no longer necessary. But that we don't know when that will be, when Jesus returns maybe. And, God's law is perfect. When we refer to God's law, we're talking about the Old Testament. And reflecting on this, Dallas Willard, he's got some beautiful turns of phrase that I found really helpful. He says, God's true law also possesses an inherent beauty in its own right, as an expression of the beautiful mind of God. And he refers to the writer of Psalm 119, who, to them, he says it was a constant delight to the mind and the heart. And I think that gives us a different perspective on God's law to what we normally think of, which is this kind of constraining rules. Later he says, the law of God marks the movements of God's kingdom, of his own actions, and of how that kingdom works. When we keep the law, we step into his ways and drink in his power. When we keep the law, we step into his ways and drink in his power. I don't know about you, but I want that. I want to step into his ways and I want to drink in his power. But how do we do that? Excuse me. Because Jesus then goes on to say, your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. If you're going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless it does, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. So how do we do this? What does righteousness mean? And often we think of righteousness about this moral code. It's about moral correctness. And I referred to a book called Unchristian, which came out in 2007 and was based on a whole lot of research among 16 to 29-year-olds. And without going into the detail of that book, or rehashing what I said this morning, the basic premises of the book is that the church has an image problem in the world, and part of it is because we are seen so often as what we stand against rather than what we stand for. That's not the righteousness that Jesus is talking about. The righteousness that Jesus is talking about is something that comes from within. It shows itself outwardly, and it is about what we do, but it comes from the attitudes and belief that we hold. And so if we want to do what Jesus did, if we want to walk in his ways, if we want to drink in his power, like Dallas Willard says, we need to be transformed by his Spirit, empowered by his Spirit. And there's a couple of really encouraging verses that I quoted in Jeremiah 31 to 34. I didn't quote the whole thing, but he says this, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. In Ezekiel 36, 26 to 27, he says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in me. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. and I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. So God's part is to do this work of transformation in us through the Spirit. Our part is to lean into that and take every opportunity and do everything we can to enable God to work in us, to continually invite the Holy Spirit to transform us, to fill us, and to follow Jesus closely, to pay attention to his life and his words and his teaching, just as we're doing in this series on the Sermon on the Mount, in order that we might become more like him and that this stuff just becomes natural for us. And I gave the example of what does a life like this look like, and talked about Mother Obeah, Suzanne Obeah, who set up the Sisters of Compassion, and much of that establishment of that came in Jerusalem, up the Wanganui River before she moved to Wellington. But her whole life was given to caring for the poor, the sick, the needy, the vulnerable, the abandoned. That was her life's work. And that reminds me of the people that we see who are the blessed ones in the Beatitudes, which Mel's spoke about a few weeks back. It also reminded me of the parable of Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats, and the ones who will get into heaven are the ones who who fed the hungry, who gave water to the thirsty, who visited the sick, who visited those in prison, who clothed the naked. And so there is for our righteousness to exceed that of the Pharisees. It isn't about our kind of moral correctness. It isn't about what we think we should do or not do. It's about how we live. And that comes from the Spirit at work within us. So let's invite the Spirit to do what the Spirit needs to do. As one of my former vicars used to pray, let's ask God to do in us what he needs to do so that he can do what he wants to do through us. And that's my prayer for all of us this week. Have a great time in your small group.